Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Healing Collective Trauma, a process for integrating our intergenerational and cultural wounds, by Thomas Hübl and Julie Jordan Avred. Foreword by William Ury. Narrated by Daniel Henning. Bowing down to the revelation of our emerging future, which is calling us. Foreword. It is a great pleasure to commend to you this insightful, wise, and critically important book on healing collective trauma, written by my friend and colleague Thomas Hübl. For the last 40 years, I've had the chance to witness the deep impacts of collective trauma while serving as a third-party and negotiation advisor in conflicts and wars around the world, most recently in the Colombian Civil War, the Korean nuclear crisis, and the Middle East conflict. I have experienced just how difficult, frustrating, and elusive it can be to bring bloodshed to an end. The big question I have often asked myself is, why is peace so challenging when it brings so much benefit? Especially given that war inevitably brings great loss to all parties and their societies. There are many reasons, but surely one of the most central is the underlying collective trauma that remains unaddressed. During the Korean War, millions of people died and millions more were displaced. More than 200,000 people were killed in the Colombian Civil War, and more than 7 million were displaced. Even when a semblance of normality returns, the underlying scars remain. With unhealed wounds, there appears to be a drive to keep repeating the same patterns of conflict. Truces or peace agreements are often difficult to sustain. One of the great historic innovations of the Colombian peace process was the involvement in the negotiations of members of the civilian population, the victims of that civil war. Numerous delegations of war victims were invited to come to Havana to testify to the negotiators on both sides about their experiences and to be heard by the media and Colombian society. These individuals were selected carefully by the UN and national universities to reflect the diversity on all sides of the conflict. Many, perhaps most, were women. To the surprise of many observers who feared the experiment would stir up old wounds and obstruct the peace process, the great majority of the victims did not call for punishment, but rather appealed to end this vicious conflict and offered the prospect of forgiveness and reconciliation with their enemies. Giving voice to the war's victims, offering empathetic listening and bringing positive societal attention to the trauma, not only reminded the negotiators of what was at stake, but helped Colombian society begin the slow process of healing old wounds. If we are to bring about peace and, more generally, well-being in our world, it is essential that we learn more about collective trauma and how we can heal it. That is why this pioneering book by Thomas Hübl is so valuable. It helps us see the dimensions of the collective trauma underlying the world's ills and highlights the opportunities we have to heal our communities and ourselves. As a complex phenomenon, not easy to grasp, collective trauma benefits from the wide-ranging perspectives that Thomas brings. In this work, you will find an unusual blend of the material and the mystical. Thomas combines a keen psychological and scientific curiosity with a deep spiritual understanding. The result is greater insight from which we can all benefit. One valuable lesson I've learned from Thomas is the wisdom of our responses to trauma. Rather than stigmatizing our tendency to freeze in reaction to overwhelming stress, Thomas compassionately underscores the intelligence that the freeze response reflects. It is this same intelligence that we need to harness if we are to heal our wounds. Perhaps most importantly, while Thomas delves into the inner collective darkness, he never loses hope for humanity. Even as he seeks conceptual clarity and deep understanding, he keeps his focus on what is practical and useful to the great task at hand. He shows us a way to open our minds, open our hearts, and thus open our individual and collective will to peace. Since each of us in our own way experiences collective trauma of some kind, each of us can benefit greatly from understanding how to heal. I am grateful for all that I have learned from Thomas about collective trauma. My sincere hope is that you will benefit from his work in the same way. Our world needs it. William Ury. Prologue. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Genesis chapter 1, verse 3. The medicine is already within the pain and suffering. You just have to look deeply and quietly. Then you realize it has been there the whole time. Saying from the Native American oral tradition. 40 years ago, Helen Epstein, a young journalism professor at New York University, published a groundbreaking book that altered the course of Western psychological research in trauma and validated many things that Aboriginal peoples and Eastern thinkers had known for centuries. The book, titled Children of the Holocaust, was part ethnography, part oral history, and part memoir, and was the first published work outside academia to explore the subjects of the second generation, 2G, the sons and daughters of Holocaust survivors. Her work inspired startling new questions. Had the unspoken horrors of Nazi Germany been in some way passed down to the descendants of those who'd lived through them? If so, what might this traumatic inheritance mean for other traumatized groups and their progeny? Epstein's book was a noble exploration of the intergenerational transmission of trauma, kicking off decades of often difficult and sometimes illuminating research in Israel, the United States, Switzerland, and beyond. While more research must be done on the subject, there is much to learn from what has emerged. In 1981, the Jewish scholar and theologian Arthur A. Cohen described 2G this way. It is the generation that bears the scar without the wound, sustaining memory without direct experience. In his 2006 text, Healing the Soul Wound, clinical psychologist and researcher Eduardo Duran assessed that in the overall body of research on the subject of historical trauma and its transmission, there is evidence to suggest that not only is the trauma passed on intergenerationally, but it is cumulative. Duran further contends that when trauma is not dealt with in previous generations, it has to be dealt with in subsequent generations. Moreover, when unresolved trauma is passed on, it may become more severe in successive generations. Early in his career, Duran's work with Native American populations in California uncovered a critical cultural difference in how the indigenous community perceived and spoke about the effects, consequences, or symptoms of historical trauma that they directly experienced, such as poverty, illness, alcoholism, family separation, mental and emotional health conditions, and more. The Western world had become dominated by clinical, pathological descriptions and labels for all manner of emotional and interpersonal distress. But these communities didn't use such terms. Instead, they referred to the suffering that had blighted their people during European colonization and had been passed down through the generations since as spiritual injury, soul sickness, soul wounding, and ancestral hurt. My work has shown me that trauma is never purely an individual problem. And no matter how private or personal, trauma cannot belong solely to a family, or even to that family's intricate ancestral tree. The consequences of trauma, indeed, the cumulative effects of personal, familial, and historical traumas, seep across communities, regions, lands, and nations. The burden borne by a single person, family, or community invariably and inevitably reaches its larger society, touching even those who share little in the way of common identity or custom. The impact of human-created suffering extends beyond the original.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?